I appreciate y'all wanting to torture yourselves by having me over here. But I had never, when he asked me to do something on the chaplains, I had never done anything. I've spoken on the revival in the Confederate Army, armies, because it wasn't just one, many times, more than any other subject. But the thing of it is, I had never dealt with this, and so I had to start from scratch. It's too large a subject, as most subjects are that we deal with, to deal with in a meeting like this. I could spend a whole thing of chaplaincy in the Confederate Armies 101 and spend a whole semester and not really do more than scratch the surface and do it the justice that it deserves. But from the beginning, the Confederate chaplains worked in spite of many difficulties. Different regulations existed for Army chaplains and post chaplains. They were not issued uniforms, they had no rank, but in spite of these and a host of obstacles that I'll touch on some of them but don't have time for all of them, they served in the Confederate Army, serving the Lord, and involved, and during that time had the greatest revival of record in any army in the world that's ever happened and taken place. And before I proceed, I forgot to do this, Keith, like this. Ordinarily, I would have had my suit and tie on. But that fella ain't here tonight, is he? But actually, I would have had it on. But in case you wonder what this is and what that is, 150 years, I'm doing it to honor my grandfather. 150 years ago, the first week of October, he was being ushered into Point Lookout as a prisoner of war. So I wore this shirt and my medal for honoring my grandpa. All righty. Well, most folks, as you know, it was their great-grandpa or great-great-grandpa and some great-great-great-grandpas that served, but my dad was a real son because his daddy fought them low-down invading, murdering, raping, looting, burning heathen from the north. And one of the great honors that I had as commander at High Point was giving Miss Mattie Rice, presenting her with a real SCV Real Daughter Certificate and Medal. And what a great pleasure that was. And I was blessed to have a part in her funeral. And Lord willing, I'll have a part in her memorial down yonder. All righty, now we'll get into, there's too much, as I said, related to deal with this, but to lay the starting point out before us, I will begin with a quote from the Memoirs of Dr. Charles Todd Quintard, M.D. and D.D., chaplain of the 1st Tennessee Regiment. This will be a rather long quote, but I believe sums up why God could use the chaplains of the Confederate States armies so very successful. Not only, this begins the quote, not only was the conviction of conscience clear in the Southern soldiers that they were right in waging war against the federal government, but the people of the South looked upon their cause as a holy one, and their conduct of affairs, civil and military, was wholly in accord with such a view. The Confederacy, as it was, well, simply as it came into existence, really, committed its civil affairs by deliberate choice to men not only of approved morality, but of approved religious character as well. That's a far cry from today, or even in the North back then. It was not merely by accident that in the organization of its army, choice was made of such men as Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Jackson, not to mention a large number of other Christian soldiers and leaders, because we don't have time. And it seemed in no way incongruous in the conduct of a war of such character that commissions were offered to and accepted by Reverend William Nelson Pendleton, rector of Grace Church, Lexington, Virginia, and the Right Reverend Leonidas Pope, D.D., Bishop of Louisiana. A religious tone pervades the state papers pertaining to the Confederacy, its proclamations, and its legislation. The same religious tone is conspicuous in a majority of the military leaders. It is found upon investigation to have impressed itself upon the officers of regiments and companies and upon the private soldiers in the ranks throughout the Army, so that there is more than an ordinary basis for the statement, surprising as such a statement may appear at first, that the armies of the Confederate States had in them a larger proportion than any other in history of true and active Christian men. And that is a fact. I could stand and read and read and read the list of officers, for example, that were indeed already Christians, and then many of them that were saved during the war. The provision made for the spiritual needs of the men in the field was quite remarkable. In the great haste with which the Army of the Confederacy was organized, equipped, and sent into the field, there might have been found abundant apology for the omission of chaplains from the official staffs. Yet there was no need for seeking such an apology, for the chaplains were not overlooked, nor was their work in vain. The camps of regiments which had been sent forth with prayer and blessings were often the place of revival. They were a regimental institution, and their numbers might be determined by the number of regiments engaged in the war. They were, for the most part, men of, means, brains, a keen sense of humor, and of faithfulness to their duty, sticking to their post, ready to give up their horses to some poor fellows with bare and blistered feet, and march in the column as it hurried forward, going on picket duty with their men, bivouacking with them in the pelting storms, sharing with them at all times their hardships and dangers. That was a long quote, wasn't it? But that was the chaplain in his memoirs. That was his description in starting out about the Confederate soldiers and how that I'll mention get the negativity out of the way. You know, a lot of people say, well, we need to be all positive. If you believe that, you're not very smart. You got you thinking now, and you want to see what I'm fixing to say, aren't you? The reason I say that, I remember one time I was going to make the nominating speech for Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the SCV, who was Ron Castile. Chuck McMichaels, who later on was was the commander-in-chief. He was going to make the seconding speech. I was to make the nominating speech. And he commenced with all that junk about being all positive. And he finally turned around to me and he said, what do you think, Herman? I said, I think I'm fed up with all this garbage about all positive. I said, if you believe that, give me the key to your car. I'll go out there and disconnect your negative battery cable, and then when you go out there, let's see what happens. I said, it takes both of them. It's got to be the balance. And I said, Herman is going to be positively negative. Well, then he looked at Ron Castile and said, Ron, what do you think? And Ron talked real slow. He said, well, I'll tell you. He said, Brother Herman prays about what he does. He's read to me everything that he's ever written. And I've never heard anything I didn't agree with. Brother Herman's got the Spirit and he can say anything he wants to. And I can still tell you the boot. 1,039 for Castile, 190 for the lawyer. But seriously, it takes both. God knows that. He's the commandments, you check them. There are thou shalts and there are thou shalt nots. See? Well, anyway, let me get on that. But I'll briefly relate some of the few negatives related to the chaplains, and there's a lot of it that I know that won't be in here, but I can just think about it, and it's funny to me. But early on, there were many that were entering with an attitude that could be described as romantic adventure. Some of the officers were afraid that a chaplain preaching the gospel and exhorting the realness of death and the certainty of hell for the unbeliever would have an adverse effect upon them going into battle. Of course, it had the opposite effect. Of course, those officers were not serving the Lord, and their thinking was the opposite of what was true. One brigadier general, after a message, said in disgust, those confounded chaplains, they're a scourge of the army. Mercy. You can tell he didn't love the Lord. Even the devout General Stonewall Jackson, a man most gentle and kind with all ministers, could not restrain his criticism of some of those chaplains, though small in number. According to Dr. Jones, I won't go into the long thing that he wrote, but he did write criticizing a very little small number, but he knew that they could have a very detrimental effect upon those soldiers. And there were some of the soldiers were complaining, not to him, but he observed this because he was involved with the spiritual part of the needs of his armies. And anyhow, Dr. Jones, I lost my place here. Here we go. By 1862, these that thought it was a romantic adventure realized that this was no holiday excursion, but a very bloody conflict. Thus, this type of chaplain disappeared about as quick as he arrived. Spiritually, the folks, I got a page wrong. I got it in backwards. I got page 4 over here and page 5 over here. All righty, I know that didn't look right. Some positive now, and the rest of it primarily is. Beginning early on, from the churches of the South and from the ranks came men of God. They were from every denomination, and their sole desire was to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to the men. There were a few occasions when some smug preachers back home or on writing in periodicals like the Religious Herald out of Richmond had criticism for the Chaplains Corps. Reverend J. William Jones said that in answering some of these critics, that General J.B. Gordon wrote, quote, "But suppose I tell these good Christians," and he was being sarcastic, "who think preaching to a body of soldiers is, quote, casting pearls before swine, unquote, quote, that these men, exposed as they are to temptation on every side, are more eager to listen to the gospel than them people are back home," unquote. The general got them. In spite of criticism and misunderstanding in the early days of the war, many of the South's finest ministers volunteered for service. Typical of such men was Reverend Ac Hopkins, formerly pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Martinsburg, West Virginia. On a side note, one of his former parishioners was none other than Miss Belle Boyd, who was to gain worldwide fame as a Confederate spy. He became chaplain to the 2nd Virginia Regiment and was reunited with many of his former friends and parishioners, among whom was Private Ben Boyd, father of Belle Boyd. On May 16, 1862, Chaplain Hopkins led the regiment in a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer as proclaimed by President Jefferson Davis. He threw his whole heart into his work, for he realized that man must be prepared, now I got to go back, spiritually for the hard battles ahead. May 23 through May 25, Jackson beat up on Union General Banks at Front Royal. Like the rest of the chaplains, Reverend Hopkins was kept busy attending to the wounded and burying the dead. In less than a month, he had become a confirmed veteran. Within this short period of service, he had learned to wait upon the wounded and dying, held prayer meetings daily at headquarters, preached when possible, and learned to share the marches, dangers, and sorrows of the men. In this short time, he had endeared himself to every man of his regiment. Those folks that thought it was a lark, to sum up what I said a while ago, a romantic adventure, it didn't take long if they went with them like they should, like this chaplain did, to experience what I just read. And in a month's time, he'd become a veteran already. Disagreements about pay. This from the civilian government. They come swiftly after Congress's authorization to have a chaplain's corps. Bill 102, approved on May 3, 1861, gave the President authorization to appoint chaplains in the Confederate States Armies. This bill also stipulated their monthly salary was to be $85. Whoa! I knew right off when I read that before I read the rest of that about the bill. Somebody wasn't going to like that, because it's kind of like the old saying about a woman, about keep her pregnant and barefooted. Just as long as their attitude was, just as long as he can exist, their attitude, well, man, God will take care of him. Well, God was expecting them to be a part of that taking care of him, see? But that's another subject. But anyway, these folks, now show you, they got to thinking about that. Some of them fellows from back home that hadn't been out there knowing what chaplains that already were doing even before they were officially called a chaplain. They were there serving. 13 days later, they changed it to $50. those congressmen who opposed higher salaries said all the chaplain has to do is preach once a week, and they carried the point. So they got it reduced. They wanted to get it way lower, but they finally compromised at 50. The fellow, would you believe it, the fellow's name was Sparrow, that was pushing to cut him even more. I guess he felt like bird seed was enough for him being a sparrow. Mercy. There was somebody told me one time, said, I wish I had a job like you, preach twice a week, and maybe on Wednesday nights. And of course he was stupid. First of all, he was stupid for saying that to me. And he was stupid to have the idea that he had. That showed how ignorant he was. I told him, I said, if you think that's all there is to it, I'll tell you what I'll do. The next time somebody calls me at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning and wants me to go break the bad news to a mom and daddy that their only daughter just got killed, splattered in a car wreck, I'll call you. Because I've done that. And folks, there ain't nothing pleasant about it. I still think about one that I did that to, and the daddy wondered what I was doing there that time of the night. And I said, well, go wake up your wife. Go bring your wife in here. But that wife had been wakened, and she started screaming because she knows what has happened to my young'un. That is not a good feeling. But I've done it. It still makes me want to cry. And I'm glad I can be touched by it. To make it possible for chaplains with families to serve, most denominations adopted the practice of supplementing their salaries. During the fourth session of Congress, January 22, 1864, a bill was passed stating that chaplains in the Army in actual field service shall be entitled to draw forage for one horse, provided he has a horse in use and would be able to eat the rations of a private. Well, bless their hearts, they were being generous, weren't they? The amazing fact that I have mentioned in speaking about the revivals in the Southern armies, about how that everything works so good. A lot of people say, well, you have Baptist, Methodist, said, how did all that work? I said, it's very simple. They preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and not church doctrine. The biggest part of what people preach is church doctrine. The first chaplain or second chaplain's conference that I went to, and I'm proud of the fact I'm unique. I'm the only one in the SCV, and I'm the only one can ever say that until the time that I don't ever get to go because I cross Old Chili or whatever. But they were discussing, not during the session, but just standing around talking. Someone would discuss, well, whose theology do you follow? You know what I tell them? Well, I follow Jesus, Paul, Peter, James, and all them fellows. That's who I follow. It's the gospel. Most of church doctrine is man's doctrine. Well, there were some of these that wanted to do it, and I've read in their writings, in their diaries, they really wanted to do it, but they didn't. They constrained themselves. And of course, when I get to it, you'll find what General Stonewall Jackson thought about that to begin with. But Although there was no Army chief of chaplains to direct their work, the chaplains moved quickly into an amazing, very amazingly, and harmonious system of work. General Stonewall Jackson was especially helpful in his suggestions concerning the work of the chaplains. Due largely to his own personal efforts, his Second Corps was better supplied with chaplains than any other of the Army of Northern Virginia. His standards were quite high, but simple. His words from, come on, Brother White, you can say it. His words from him that were given to us by the Reverend J. William Jones, no less, was this, quote, denominational distinctions should be kept out of view and not touched upon. And as a general rule, I do not think that a chaplain who would preach denominational sermons should be in the Army. Bless you, Stonewall. I would like to see no question asked in the Army of what denomination a chaplain belongs to. But let the question be, does he preach the gospel? Unquote. That's General Stonewall. Love that fellow. My daddy said that he had heard his daddy say many a time that no matter what General Stonewall Jackson, and Grandpa was in his Second Corps, or General Robert E. Lee would have asked the men to do, they would do it if it cost them their lives to do it. They would put forth the effort to do it. Indication of the cooperation was contained in a report of Dr. William Hoag concerning the revival in Barksdale Brigade in Fredericksburg, Virginia. This was, of course, after they had whooped up on them. When was that? December 13, and the mopping up the 14th. And then Dr. J. William Jones went to check to see how the revival was coming, because they wondered about how the effects of the cold and the snow and all that stuff, as well as the battle and all, was affecting the revival. So he found out when he got there, and Dr. Hoag is reporting concerning this that Dr. Jones told. He told how many had been saved up until the point when he got there, and that night there was 75, I think, and that made 187 that had been saved thus far in the revival. There was 112 when he got there. So it was going good. And it was in the Episcopal Church that would seat 1,200, and said that it was standing room only. Anyhow, Dr. Hoag's report said, quote, we had a Presbyterian preaching a sermon introduced by a Baptist under the direction of a Methodist chaplain in an Episcopal church. I like that. Reverend somebody Owens, I believe. I don't remember if he was the one or the one that made the report. But he told about they got orders the night that Dr. Jones was there to move out the next morning. And the preacher, and it was Owens, I think was his name, said, God will not permit this while the revival is going so good. And as I've said before, you know, a lot of people say, boy, he went out on a limb. No, he didn't. God let him know that. And it was borne out because the next morning the order was countermanded and they said the revival is continuing. So, you know, a lot of people today, they know more than God does, they think. But God was working. And that man was prompted by God's Spirit to say what he said. Nowadays, they'd say he was a fanatic. Nowadays, they'd say Stonewall Jackson was a fanatic. We need more fanatics in the churches. In the West, the degree of cooperation among the chaplains was rather remarkable. Near Camden, Arkansas, there were 2 Methodist and 2 Baptist chaplains at Camp Yale. When I come across that name, Camp Yale, and that's Yale, like, I wondered if it had to do with the rebel Yale, that they named it Camp Yale. But anyway, it was difficult, the fella said, to tell the denomination from their preaching and the instructions given to those seeking help. Again, there's a reason for that. It's because they was preaching the gospel and not denominational stuff. And when the converts presented themselves for membership, then Chaplain Horace Jewell dealt with those who desired to unite with the Methodist Church, and Chaplain Cochran with those that wished to unite with the Baptist Church. After this, often the services, whether evangelistic or prayer meetings, were conducted by soldiers themselves, because some of them were preachers, but also some of them were deacons and just laymen. General Pendleton often donned his ecclesiastical vestments and preached to the men, as did General Polk and other generals. A Presbyterian chaplain from North Carolina wrote that sometimes they felt as if they were in camp meeting rather than in the army, expecting to meet an enemy. I got a list of, I don't know how many chaplains from North Carolina and the units they were in, but it's not an exhaustive list. I thought about copying it, but it's too much, and we wouldn't have time for it anyway. I got to hurry. We got to get out by 10. The chaplains were held in high esteem, especially after the spring of 1862. A lot of them bad eggs had already flew the coop, and these men that were there now, most of them had stuck it out in the thick of some of those hot battles, and many of them were still coming in from home. They had no uniforms or military titles. They were addressed affectionately as brother, doctor, and in the Roman Catholics as father. The men thought of them as their chaplains and not officers in the army. Nor did high-ranking officers consider consultations by their chaplains to be a nuisance. They were always received with the greatest respect. Chaplain Kinsey John Stewart recalled an incident near Leesburg, Virginia. Generals Lee and Jackson were upstairs consulting relative to battles. On a lower floor, the chaplain prepared for evening prayers. When all was in readiness, the chaplain sent word to the officers to come down for prayer. They immediately responded to the call to prayer. And the fellow writing that said no officer would have dared to do what the chaplain dared to do. Well, he didn't count that a problem. You know why? Because he knew those men loved the Lord. And he had no qualms about that, because he respected them, but they also respected him as God's man. And they cared about their men. I'm getting a glare. I keep moving. Some examples of duties in hospitals and fields of battle. The first being hospitals. A young captain lay in agony in an overcrowded hospital with doctors ignoring him to work on them where there was hope. That might sound cruel, but they had to make a choice. And those men knew this man's dying. There's no point in us wasting, and this may sound bad, but there's no point in our wasting our time with them when we need to try to help these that we can help, and not only help them by whatever means they needed help with their wounds, but there's always hope of them getting back in battle. But this man's dying. And remember, they were limited. They didn't have an overabundance of doctors. And they had to make choices such as this. And you know they didn't make those decisions lightly. And you know they didn't have any pleasure in that. I don't know any of them. I wasn't alive then. But I have no reason to believe that it was not heartrending for them to have to leave someone that's dying and choose to get this fella that they can help, because that fella's dying. Anyway, only the chaplain, a gray-haired man of over 60 winters, stood by him in his dying moments. Seeing the chaplain, he said, thank God, a minister has come." Kneeling by the soldier and gently wiping the sweat from his brow, the chaplain began to softly sing a song that figures familiar to every one of us, "Just as I Am." Charlotte Elliott wrote that in the 1700s. She was, to put it nicely, a girl of the night in a mill village in England. And she heard music playing one night as she plied her trade one Saturday night. And she went in to see what was going on, and there was a revival in there. And God got a hold of her and saved her. And she wrote that song. "Just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me. Just as I am, I come." Whew. There's more to it than that, but I got to move on. But that's what he began to softly sing to that man. A peacefulness swept over the captain's countenance, and he slipped into a state of unconsciousness. And then the chaplain moved on in his endless visitation to the sick and wounded and dying, with tears coming down his cheeks. Sometimes the wounded on the field of battle had to lie for a long time where they fell. The chaplains ministered to them as best they could, wrapping them, if they had something to wrap them with, to keep them warm, and giving them water. A few hours later, the chaplain would hold quivering heads of many as the surgeons performed the necessary amputations. If the soldier was dying, he recorded his name, his home address, and any last words for his loved ones. The diaries of the chaplains testify how vividly they recall these experiences and last words. I wonder if it was as vivid as that I spoke about a while ago about the young woman that I told about telling her mom and daddy their only child had been killed. That's still just as vivid in my mind. I can see it just as good as I can see y'all. And I dare say that these scenes again and again was burned into the minds of those dear men of God. One of the most faithful and beloved chaplains in Shelby's division of the Army of Trans-Mississippi was known affectionately as Uncle Bob. He was especially devoted to the sick and wounded. Chaplain Rennick did not go amongst the soldiers as a fearful backslapper, etc., but he was among them as a servant of God, carrying out his duties as such, and he was the most popular fellow in their outfit. On the battlefield, there were some that felt the chaplains should not be exposing themselves, but should be at a first aid place or hospital to minister to the wounded and dying there. After an editor took them to task for being with their unit in combat, he got an answer about a week later signed by the name A Wounded Chaplain. To sum up his answer, I'll just say that it was, we do not need advice from someone far removed from battle and sitting safely behind the desk, but the belief must be accepted, was and still is, that it must be left to the enlightened and conscientious chaplain to decide whether or not it is that he is going to expose himself in battle. When Chaplain IT, and I don't know if I've got his name right or not, Tichenor, Tiechenor, whatever that is, of the 17th Alabama Regiment, wrote the governor of Alabama concerning the Battle of Shiloh. He told the men wavering under a crossfire that was coming from 3 directions. He kept to his feet, waving his hat and urging them to stand there and die there if need be for our country. In his report, he said the regiment lost 13 killed, 117 wounded and missing. The dead of the enemy was 352. Chaplain Tichenor did not mention to the governor the fact, but it came out in newspapers later when somebody else reported it, that the chaplain himself had fought with the coolness and intrepidity of a veteran, killing with his rifle a colonel, a major, and 4 privates. Yay for the chaplain. I'm about done, but I'm just going to hit the high spots. There are those individuals, and Reverend Dr. Dabney was one of them, that this, it don't matter what, you ain't going till your time comes. And them folks that believe that evidently missed it in the Bible whenever God said you can shorten your days or you can lengthen them. Whoa. Well, anyhow, Reverend Dabney, there was a real hot battle going on, and he's behind this big post, like this. And one of the soldiers afterward, the battle said, "Hey, what was you doing up there? I thought you said, why, and I'm putting it in my words, summing it up. Why was you hiding behind there? If the bullet ain't intended for you, it ain't going to get you no how. That's what you tell us." And he said, "Well, you don't exactly understand providence." He said he was taking advantage of the providence of that post. Now, it was more to it than that, but that's the crux of it. But simply in closing, the message of the Confederate chaplain was more than a diatribe on Southern rights. These military chaplains were dealing with the living Word of God and dying men. This fact is shown in texts chosen for their sermons and the subject matter in them. That's why that brigadier general that I told you early on said they're the scourge of the army, because the chaplain had preached a message from God's Word about the need to be saved, and that in eternity, of course, and I'm summing it up, it's either heaven or hell, and if you want to go to heaven, you're going to have to be ready. And the Brigadier General didn't exactly take to his message. Oh well. But anyhow, it was shown in the millions of tracts passed out. The message is in the soldiers' favorite songs. And his, the chaplain's pleas to turn from sin to righteousness. And nowhere was the effect of the chaplain's preaching of God's Word more obvious than in the hearts of the fighting men. No wonder there was a revival throughout the Confederate Army. One fella said that as of January 1865, it was estimated from, and I won't go into all the different ways that they determined it, records, newspaper articles, whatever, that there had been at least 150,000 saved. Then another one, and I believe it was Dr. W.W. Bennett, who later was president of Randolph-Macon College, said that there was, in April of that year, in other words, when the war in essence ended, that there was over 150,000 that had been saved, and that fully a third of the Confederate Army was, and I presume he was talking about the Army in Northern Virginia, that a third of them were members of some branch, as he termed it, of the Christian church. It's mind-boggling. The revival, I can tell you when it started. October the 4th, 1862, in Camp Nineveh on Front Royal Pike between Winchester and Front Royal. Not long after, Sharpsburg. And it started. And it was in Jackson's Second Corps. I won't go into that, but that's a good thing too. I can talk about that too, and it don't cost you a thing. But it's no wonder when you had people like General Lee, General Jackson, many other high-ranking officers, and many of them got saved during the time. Then you had many in the civilian ranks like President Jefferson Davis. And remember, he that tooteth not his own horn, it shall not be tooted. I'm going to fix to toot my horn. Lord willing, next June the 6th, in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, I will be the keynote speaker for the memorial service for General, get out of here, General, President Jefferson Davis. And I count it a great honor to be asked. But I'm going to tell you, I thought about it when we was coming down the road after Shirley and myself were coming, got back out on the interstate, and they had invited me to be the speaker next year, and there's been some great speakers up there. You say, don't that bother you? No, I do my thing, let them do theirs. But the thing of it is, as I go back out on the highway, I'm thinking about that, and I like the question, why honor President Jefferson Davis? Why not? And I can take that and I can write a talk fare you well out of it, and then they'll shoot them cannons. If you want to be at a good event, 9 o'clock, June 6, 2015, and I told them if Jesus don't come or call, I'll be there. Y'all planning on going already, aren't you? All right. I'm about one more sentence. As I said already, it's no wonder with people like that we had such a great revival amongst our ancestors taking place. And remember, it didn't end at the end of the war. Those men went back. Many of them had no homes. Many of them had nothing. But whatever the case, many of them continued to preach. Some of them that were not preachers were called into the ministry and was preaching. There was revival still going on in that terrible time called Reconstruction. They like them good sounding words, them low down heathen, don't they? They like to use big words like xenophobia and homophobia. Well, I contend they've got Confederate-phobia. I do. But the thing of it is, it was not Reconstruction, it was destruction. Now, they were wanting to reconstruct the people of the South into the image they wanted them to be. That's the only way you could call it Reconstruction. But through that time, over into the 80s, the 90s, and over into the 20th century, revival was continuing. You won't find that in your church history books. I've taught church history. It's not in there, because them heathens wrote the books. But it's there, and they did it. I want to promote one book before I sit down. He was never in the army. He was a Presbyterian pastor, Dr. He had 3 different initials. Handy was his last name, Handy. The book is published by Sprinkle Publishing in Harrisonburg, Virginia. That has been such a blessing to the Southern cause by getting the old books out and reprinting them. And in this, he was a Presbyterian preacher, had pastored in Delaware, was in Tidewater, Virginia. He got a pass from the Union General to go to Delaware on vacation. He preached up there, and there was a jealous Presbyterian pastor was pastoring the church that he had one time pastored. And because naturally the people loved him and was glad to see him, and they wanted to hear him preach. And would you believe he reported to the Yankees that he was trying to get people to sympathize with the Confederacy and join in with them? Nevertheless, they took him, never charged him, kept him in Fort Delaware prison 18 months. Now, they done things like that to the other chaplains, them that were chaplains. But you ought to read, he smuggled his diary out, and you can find out what went on in that prison. It's 700 pages, and I'm telling you, you have to read slow because it's cram full. But it will bless you. And yes, there were times when he would lament that he couldn't talk denominational stuff to the fella because he was afraid he'd confuse the new convert. But I'm telling you, it'll tell you how they treated them. It'll tell you how they wouldn't give them medicine. You can learn a lot in that one book about how they treated not only them in the ministry, but our ancestors that were in the army. If you can get it, it will bless you. And I appreciate you having me, and maybe you'll have me back sometime.